What if the people sitting at your dinner table every single night are the exact reason you haven't moved forward in life? Not strangers, not enemies, not coworkers who never liked you, your own family. The people you were raised to trust without question. The people you call when something goes wrong. The people you would do anything for. What if, without even realizing it, they have been quietly pulling you back every single time you tried to rise? And here is the part that will stay with you long after this video ends. Most of them don't even know they're doing it. This is not about hate. This is not about cutting people off. This is about finally seeing something that has been invisible to you your entire life. By the time this video is over, you are going to recognize 3 specific signs that show up in families all across America, signs that are so normal, so common, so woven into everyday conversation, that most people never question them. But the ones who do question them, the ones who finally see what is really happening, those are the people who change their lives completely. Stay with this until the very end, because the third sign is the one nobody talks about, and it might be the most important thing you hear all year. There is a concept in psychology called the crab bucket mentality. If you put one crab in a bucket, it climbs right out. But if you put several crabs in a bucket together, none of them escape. Because every time one tries to climb up, the others pull it back down. And the crabs are not doing it out of cruelty. They are not planning it. They are not meeting at the bottom of the bucket and strategizing. It just happens. That is exactly what can occur inside families, and understanding this is the first step toward changing your life. Families are built on loyalty. That loyalty is one of the most beautiful things in human existence. But loyalty, when it is not examined, when it is not healthy, can become a trap. It can become a system where anyone who starts to think differently, earn differently, live differently, or dream differently, is unconsciously pressured back into the shape the family has always known. Not because the family is evil, but because change feels like a threat to the people who chose not to change. Think about this. When someone in a family starts doing well, starts a business, gets promoted, moves to a better neighborhood, loses weight, stops drinking, starts setting boundaries, what often happens? Instead of pure celebration, there is sometimes tension. There are comments. There are small jokes. There are questions that feel less like curiosity and more like cross-examination. There are conversations that happen behind closed doors that the person who is growing never fully hears. This is not a rare experience. This is one of the most common patterns in American family dynamics, and it has been studied, documented, and written about by therapists, sociologists, and family counselors for decades. The reason so many people never recognize it is because it never looks like betrayal. It looks like concern. It sounds like advice. It feels like love, and that is what makes it so hard to see. Now let's get into the first sign, and this one is going to sound so familiar that it might feel uncomfortable. The first sign is something called supportive discouragement. This is when someone in your family appears to be supportive on the surface, but underneath every conversation about your goals, there is a quiet, steady stream of doubt. It is never loud. It is never aggressive. It does not come in the form of someone screaming at you that you are going to fail. It comes wrapped in care. It comes disguised as realism. It sounds like, "I just don't want to see you get hurt." It sounds like, "I'm only saying this because I love you." It sounds like, "Have you really thought this through?" Here is a real example of how this plays out. Imagine a woman in her early 40s. Let's call her Patricia. Patricia has spent 20 years working in a job she does not love, and she finally decides to take an online course and start a small business from home. She is nervous, but excited. The night she tells her family, her sister says, "That's great, but do you really have time for that with everything on your plate?" Her mother says, "I just hope you're not throwing money away." Her husband says, "Sure, go for it." But over the next few weeks, every time she sits down to work on her business, there is something else that needs her attention. Dinner isn't made. The kids need a ride. There's a family event. No one is screaming at Patricia. No one is telling her to stop. But somehow, 3 months later, she has made almost no progress, and she feels guilty about the time she has tried to spend on herself. That is supportive discouragement. It is not one big moment. It is 1,000 tiny moments that accumulate into a wall that she never saw being built. The reason this is so effective, and so difficult to confront, is because the people doing it genuinely believe they are helping. Patricia's mother truly does not want to see her daughter lose money. Patricia's sister truly is concerned about her stress levels. These are not lies, but the effect of their words is the same as if they wanted her to fail, because doubt planted early enough does not need to be watered. It grows on its own. There is research published in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships showing that people are far more likely to abandon personal goals when the people closest to them express doubt, even indirectly, compared to when strangers or acquaintances do the same thing. The closeness of the relationship gives the doubt more weight. When someone you trust deeply questions your ability, your brain does not file it away as outside criticism, it files it as truth. This is why so many people walk through life with a voice in their head that sounds suspiciously like someone they grew up with. And this leads into something important, something that separates people who break through from people who stay stuck. The ones who break through are not people who had no doubt planted in them. They are people who learn to recognize the voice and stop treating it like a fact. They learned that love and support are not the same thing, and that someone can love you deeply and still be one of the biggest obstacles in your path, not out of malice, but out of their own fear. Here is the question worth asking right now. When you think about the last time you shared a big dream or a serious goal with your family, what happened in the 48 hours after that conversation? Did you feel more energized or less? Did you feel seen or quietly talked out of it? That answer tells you a great deal. Now, stay with this because the second sign is more subtle than the first, and in many ways it is more damaging. The second sign is what therapists call identity anchoring. This is when your family, without meaning any harm, keeps you locked to an older version of yourself. They call you by old nicknames that carry old meanings. They tell the same stories about you at every gathering: the time you failed, the time you were scared, the time you made a mistake 20 years ago. They expect you to play the same role you played as a child: the quiet one, the difficult one, the funny one who never takes anything seriously, the irresponsible one, the one who always needs help. And here is the insidious part: you start playing the role, because when you walk into that house, something shifts. The person you have worked hard to become in your daily life suddenly feels thin, like a costume, and the old version of you, the one this family has always known, feels like the real you. This phenomenon has a name in psychology. It is called role reversion, and it has been studied extensively in the context of family systems therapy. The basic finding is this: families develop what are known as homeostatic patterns, ways of functioning that feel stable and familiar. When one member of the family begins to change, to grow, to heal, to evolve, the rest of the system, unconsciously, works to restore the original balance. Not because they are cruel, because all systems resist change. It is a form of self-preservation. Let's put a face on this. Think about a man named David. David grew up in a family where he was labeled the troublemaker. He got into fights in school. He dropped out of college. He made poor choices in his 20s. But by the time he is 38, David has rebuilt his life. He has been sober for 6 years. He runs a small landscaping company. He is present for his kids in a way his own father never was for him. He is genuinely different. But when he goes home for Thanksgiving, within 20 minutes of walking through the door, his older brother is telling the story about the time David got arrested in front of everyone at the table, laughing like it's still funny. His mother keeps asking if he needs anything, in a tone that suggests she still thinks he can't manage on his own. And David, strong, capable, genuinely changed David, finds himself getting irritated, withdrawing, snapping at someone, and thinking later, I don't know why I still act like a kid around them. He acts like a kid around them because they have never stopped treating him like one. The family's image of David is frozen in time, and every interaction is designed, unconsciously, to confirm that image. This is not unique to David. This plays out in millions of households across this country, and the damage it does is profound, not because it makes people fail outright, but because it creates a constant internal conflict. A person can only hold two completely different identities for so long before one of them wins. And when the environment where you spend the most emotional time tells you that the old you is the real you, the odds are not in favor of the new you surviving. The way to recognize this sign in your own life is to ask one honest question. Around your family, do you feel like the person you have worked to become, or do you feel like the person you used to be? If the answer is the person you used to be, that is not nostalgia, that is identity anchoring, and it is costing you in ways you may not even be able to measure yet. Before getting to the third sign, and again, this is the one that most people have never heard talked about this way, it is important to pause and say something clearly. None of this means your family does not love you. Almost none of what is being described here comes from a place of intentional harm. The vast majority of families that fall into these patterns are made up of people who were never taught anything different, who are doing exactly what was done to them, who are operating from fear, not malice. Understanding this matters, not to excuse the behavior, but to keep you from spending energy on resentment that would be far better spent on clarity and action. The families that are hardest to recognize as obstacles are the loving ones. The mean family is easy to see. The cold, rejecting family is obvious. But the warm family that smiles and hugs you, and then quietly, invisibly undercuts everything you are trying to build, that family is the hardest to see, and therefore the hardest to grow beyond. And that brings us directly to the third sign. The third sign is called emotional debt. This is the least talked about, the least understood, and in many cases the most powerful force keeping people from living the life they are capable of living. Emotional debt is the accumulated sense of obligation that family creates over time, not through formal agreements, not through anything written down, but through the constant, steady communication of sacrifice. You were raised, you were fed, you were cared for, things were given up for you, and without that ever being said directly, the message is clear: you owe, and the currency through which you repay is compliance. Now, every healthy family has some degree of reciprocal obligation. That is not what is being described here. What is being described is something different, a dynamic where the debt is never fully repaid, where the cost of living your own life is always framed as a kind of selfishness, where choosing yourself is treated as choosing against the family. Here is how it shows up. Someone decides to move to another city for a job opportunity, and a family member says, "I guess we'll just be strangers now." Someone sets a boundary, decides they are not going to attend a certain event, or is not going to lend money they don't have, or simply says they need space. And suddenly they are the one who has hurt the family. Someone decides to build a life that looks different from the family's life. A different religion, a different kind of partner, a different career, a different set of values, and the message that comes back, sometimes softly, sometimes not, is that they are being selfish, that they think they are better than everyone else, that they have forgotten where they came from. Forgetting where you came from is one of the most powerful tools of emotional debt. It sounds like a reminder of gratitude, but it functions as a leash, because what it actually means is, do not go too far, do not want too much, do not become something that makes the rest of us feel like we chose wrong. There is a therapist named Dr. Murray Bowen, one of the pioneers of family systems theory, who spent decades studying the way families function as emotional units. One of his central findings was that in families with low differentiation, meaning families where individual identity is not well developed, and separation from the group is not supported, any member who attempts to grow beyond the established emotional level of the family will face a powerful, predictable reaction. The family system will pressure that person to come back into alignment. The tactics are rarely conscious and rarely malicious, but they are consistent, and they are effective. The person who tries to rise is accused of thinking they are better. The person who sets limits is accused of being cold. The person who moves forward is accused of abandoning the people behind them. And because these accusations come from people the person loves, people whose approval still matters on a very deep level, even in adults, they land hard. They create guilt. And guilt, more than almost any other emotion, keeps people from taking the steps they need to take. Here is a concrete example of how emotional debt plays out over years. There is a woman, call her Sandra. Sandra grew up in a household where her mother worked 2 jobs and sacrificed a great deal. Sandra heard about those sacrifices regularly, not in an angry way, in a sad, tired way that communicated clearly. Look how much I have given for you. Sandra grew up feeling responsible for her mother's happiness. As an adult, Sandra makes decisions: where to live, who to date, what job to take, not based primarily on what is right for her life, but based on what will cause the least disruption to her mother's feelings. When Sandra finally gets a job offer in another state that could genuinely change her financial life, she turns it down. She does not turn it down because she was told to. She turns it down because the guilt of leaving feels unbearable. She has internalized the debt so completely that she polices herself without anyone even needing to say a word. 10 years later, Sandra is still in the same city, still managing her mother's emotions, still wondering why she feels stuck. And her mother, who genuinely loves her, has no idea that Sandra ever had that opportunity. That is the tragedy of emotional debt. It does not require bad intentions. It does not require anyone to be a villain. It runs on love and obligation and fear, and it costs people decades of their lives without a single dramatic moment that could be pointed to and named. The reason these 3 signs, supportive discouragement, identity anchoring, and emotional debt, are so powerful together is that they reinforce each other. The doubt planted by supportive discouragement weakens the resolve needed to resist identity anchoring. The frozen image of who you used to be makes you more susceptible to emotional debt, because the old version of you never questioned the family's authority, and the weight of emotional debt makes it nearly impossible to push back against supportive discouragement without feeling like a bad person for doing so. These 3 things form a system, and systems are much harder to escape than individual problems. So what does any of this have to do with some of the most talked about figures in American business and culture? Look at almost every person who has built something genuinely significant, who has changed their field, their community, or their own life in a profound way, and you will find, more often than not, A moment where they had to make a choice about how much weight to give to the voices closest to them. Not a choice to stop loving their family. Not a choice to become cold or disconnected. But a choice about whether to let other people's fear determine the ceiling of their life. This is not a story that belongs only to famous people. It belongs to the woman in Ohio who finally started that business after years of quiet discouragement. It belongs to the man in Texas who moved his family to a better neighborhood, even though his relatives called him pretentious. It belongs to the daughter in Florida who stopped managing her parents' emotions and finally went back to school in her 40s. These are not famous stories, but they are real ones, and they happen every day in this country. The difference between the people who break through and the people who don't is almost never ability. It is almost always the willingness to see clearly and then to act on what they see. Seeing clearly starts with understanding something that sounds simple but is genuinely hard to accept. Being loved and being supported are not the same thing. A person can love you completely and still be, through their own unexamined fear, one of the primary reasons you are not further along in your life. Accepting this does not mean blaming them. It does not mean confronting them. It does not mean walking away from your family. It means removing from your decision-making process the weight of their doubt, their frozen image of you, and their expectation that your growth is a debt you owe them. This is called differentiation, and it is, according to decades of family therapy research, one of the single most powerful predictors of a person's ability to build a meaningful, self-directed life. Differentiated people are not cold. They are not selfish. They are not people who forgot where they came from. They are people who love their families, and also love themselves enough to refuse to let fear, someone else's fear, become the architect of their future. Now, a question worth sitting with, and this is not rhetorical. If the people closest to you had no opinion about your life, if their disappointment or approval had zero weight, what decision would you make that you have been putting off? What would you start? What would you stop? Where would you go? What would you say yes to that you have been saying no to for years? For many people, when they ask that question honestly, the answer comes quickly. And the fact that it comes quickly tells you something. It means you already know what you want. You have always known. What has been in the way is not lack of information or lack of ability. What has been in the way is the accumulated weight of other people's fear, wrapped in love, handed to you in small doses over the course of your entire life. Recognizing that is not a small thing. Most people go their entire lives without seeing it clearly. They feel vaguely stuck, vaguely resentful, vaguely unfulfilled, but they can never quite name the reason. They think they lack discipline, or confidence, or luck. They do not think to look at the water they have been swimming in since birth. The moment you see these patterns, really see them, something shifts. Not because the family changes. They may never change. Not because the dynamics disappear. They may never disappear entirely. But because you stop being unconsciously ruled by them. You can be in the room and still be yourself. You can hear the doubt and not carry it home. You can love the person and still choose your own direction. There is something worth naming here about the courage this takes, because it is real courage. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that looks brave from the outside. The quiet kind. The kind that requires you to sit with guilt, to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood by people whose understanding you have always wanted. To keep going when the voices in your head, borrowed from real voices in your past, are telling you to stop, to settle, to come back down to where you belong. That guilt is not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that you are doing something new. And new things always feel wrong before they feel right. There is a piece of research out of Stanford that found that people who were able to maintain their sense of self and their goals in the face of social pressure from close relationships, not by cutting those relationships off, but by becoming less emotionally reactive to the pressure within them, reported significantly higher levels of life satisfaction, achievement, and relationship quality over time. Let that land. Not cutting the relationship, not fighting the relationship, simply becoming less ruled by it. That shift alone was enough to change outcomes dramatically. This is the work. Not therapy necessarily, not confrontation, not ultimatums. The work is internal. It is learning to hear the doubt and say quietly, not today. It is learning to walk into the old house and stay in the new self. It is learning to love people without giving them the steering wheel of your life. For anyone watching who feels seen by any of this, who recognizes one or all three of these signs in their own family, there are a few things worth keeping in mind going forward. The first is that recognition is already a form of freedom. Most people never get here. Most people live their whole lives inside these patterns without ever having a name for them. Naming a thing does not solve it, but it is always the first step toward solving it. The second thing is that change does not require a dramatic conversation. It does not require sitting your mother down and explaining family systems theory. It does not require a confrontation, an intervention, or a falling out. In fact, those dramatic moments are often less effective than the quiet, steady practice of simply choosing differently, making one decision based on your own values instead of someone else's fear, and then another, until that becomes the pattern that replaces the old one. The third thing is that you are not betraying anyone by becoming who you are capable of becoming. This idea that growth is a kind of betrayal is one of the most destructive ideas that gets passed through families, usually without anyone meaning to pass it. It is the idea that staying small is loyalty, and that rising is abandonment. It is not true. The fullest, freest, most differentiated version of you is also, in almost every case, a better parent, a better partner, a better friend, a better child. Not because you are performing those roles out of guilt, but because you are present in them out of genuine choice. Your family did not fail you by being human. They passed on what was passed to them. Fear travels through families, the way money travels through families, from generation to generation, shaped by circumstances, refined over time, handed down without a card that explains where it came from, or what it cost. The question is never whether you received it. The question is whether you will pass it on. Every person who breaks a generational pattern, who sees the crab bucket clearly enough to climb out, does something that extends far beyond their own life. They change what gets handed to the next person. They give their children, or the people they influence, something different to carry. That is not a small thing. That is, in the truest sense of the word, a legacy. Not the kind measured in money or fame, but the kind measured in freedom. The freedom of people who come after you to build lives that were never available to the generations before. The three signs covered here, supportive discouragement, identity anchoring, and emotional debt, are not death sentences. They are patterns. And patterns can be interrupted, not by force, not by resentment, not by dramatic declarations, but by the steady, quiet, daily practice of seeing clearly and choosing accordingly. The people in your life who love you may not always understand the choices you make. They may question them. They may push back. But over time, the results of those choices speak in a language that is impossible to argue with. The version of you that has stopped shrinking, stopped second-guessing, stopped managing everyone else's fear before your own needs. That version of you is not someone your family can easily dismiss. That version of you becomes the proof. And when someone in your family sees what you built, what you became, the peace you found, they may not say it directly. Families rarely say things directly, but something shifts. And in some cases, that shift is the beginning of a new pattern. A pattern that starts with you. A pattern that says, in this family, we grow. In this family, we are allowed to become. In this family, love does not require us to stay small. That is the version of family worth building. And it starts the moment you decide to see clearly, even when seeing clearly is the hardest thing you have ever done.